King Draven was terrified of silence. Not the absence of sound, but the stillness that had settled over his marriage, a quiet so profound he was certain it was the sound of love dying. Mara, his queen, his fierce and brilliant human bride, had grown placid. Her love, once a wildfire that had consumed him, now felt like the cool, distant light of a star, something beautiful to behold, but too far away to offer any warmth. He mistook her peace for indifference, her steadiness for boredom, and in the hollow cavern of his immortal heart, a desperate, childish chaos began to bloom. He needed noise. He needed a reaction. He needed to smash the placid surface of their life just to see if she still cared enough to be angered by the ripples. So he began his campaign of cruelty, a slow and public torture disguised as courtly amusement. It started with Lady Seraphina, a woman whose laughter was like shattering glass, sharp and impossible to ignore. Draven would lean in close in the throne room, his hand on the small of her back, his voice a low murmur meant only for her but loud enough for the entire court and for Mara to see the performance of intimacy. He would watch his wife from across the great hall. She would be seated at a small table, her head bent over trade ledgers from the southern provinces, a slight frown of concentration on her brow. When she finally looked up, her gaze would meet his, and for a breathtaking second, he would see a flicker of something pain. Surprise, before it was smoothed away, replaced by a polite, placid nod. Then she would return to her work, the quill scratching softly against the parchment, a sound that screamed her disinterest louder than any shouted accusation ever could. The validation he received from Seraphina and the gasping court was a heady, addictive poison. It was a poor substitute for Mara's attention, but it was something. It filled the silence. He moved on to the Duchess of Alara, a woman of sharp wit and sharper ambition, whose verbal sparring he paraded as intellectual connection. They would debate philosophy in the gardens, their voices carrying on the breeze, their shared laughter a carefully constructed affront. Mara would sometimes walk past, a shawl draped over her slender shoulders against a chill only she seemed to feel. She would pause, offer them a small, tired smile, and continue on her way to the aviary, her steps measured and even. No jealousy. No rage. Nothing. Just that quiet, weary acceptance that felt like a blade twisting in his gut. He was a king who had conquered nations, an immortal who had seen empires rise and fall, yet he could not conquer the serene and terrible fortress of his own wife's heart. Each day was a new performance, a new attempt to provoke the woman who had once met his arrogance with a fiery passion that had brought him to his knees. He remembered their beginning, the arguments that ended in breathless kisses, the political disagreements that bled into tangled limbs and whispered confessions in the dark. She had challenged him, fought him, loved him with a ferocity that made his long, unchanging life feel vibrant and new. Where had that woman gone? Had he, in his possessive, immortal love, somehow smothered the very flame that had drawn him to her? The thought was terrifying, so he pushed it away and reached for another distraction, another pretty, laughing lady who would look at him with awe and desire, reflecting back an image of the powerful, wanted man he so desperately needed to be. He missed the signs, of course. In his frantic search for a spark, he was blind to the dimming of her light. He noticed she ate less at banquets, but assumed she was merely tired of the rich food. He saw the faint, bruised shadows beneath her eyes, but attributed them to late nights spent managing the kingdom's affairs, a task she had taken on with a quiet competence that had, at first, thrilled him and now, somehow, felt like another wall between them. He once saw her hand tremble as she reached for a goblet of water, a slight, almost imperceptible tremor she quickly stilled by clasping her hands in her lap. He had been too busy charming the Baroness of Oakhaven to give it a second thought. He was a fool, a grand and colossal fool, building a monument to his own insecurity while the foundation of his entire world crumbled beneath his feet. The annual Starlight Gala was to be the apex of his campaign. It was the most significant social event of the year, a night when every noble house in the kingdom gathered beneath the enchanted glass ceiling of the grand ballroom, which reflected the true night sky above. It was a night for romance, for politics, for show, and Draven intended to put on the performance of a lifetime. His target was Lady Isoline, a new arrival at court, a young beauty from the summer isles with hair like spun gold and eyes the color of the sea. She was everything Mara was not: loud, effervescent, and utterly transparent in her adoration of him. She was the perfect instrument for his desperate drama. He danced with her first, and second, and third, a flagrant breach of protocol that sent whispers skittering through the assembled court like dry leaves. He held her too close, his hand a possessive brand on her waist, his laughter a booming, obnoxious sound that drowned out the string quartet. And through it all, he watched Mara. She was a vision, an ethereal queen in a gown of midnight silk embroidered with silver thread that mirrored the constellations swirling above them. She stood near the dais, speaking quietly with the aging Lord Chancellor, her posture perfect, her expression serene. She did not look at him. Not once. The refusal was more potent than any glare. It was a denial of his very existence, and it stoked the fires of his frustration into a raging inferno. He led Isolene to the balcony, the cool night air a welcome shock after the heat of the ballroom. He poured 2 glasses of champagne from a waiting bottle, his movements sharp and angry. He handed one to the breathless, blushing girl, his fingers deliberately brushing against hers. He leaned against the balustrade, positioning himself so he was in Mara's direct line of sight should she choose to look up from her conversation. "The stars are beautiful tonight," Isolene murmured, her gaze fixed on his face, not the sky. "Not as beautiful as the company I keep," Draven replied, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. He raised his glass in a toast, not to Isolene, but across the room, directly at his wife. And then, she looked. Her conversation with the Chancellor ended, and her head turned. Her eyes, those deep, thoughtful pools of grey he had once willingly drowned in, found his. He held her gaze, a silent challenge, a desperate plea. "See me. Fight for me. Show me that I still matter." He saw her take in the scene, her king, her husband, on a balcony with a young, beautiful woman, sharing a private moment in the most public way possible. He saw her eyes drift down to their joined hands over the champagne glass. He braced himself for the explosion, for the tears, for the righteous fury he so richly deserved and so desperately craved. Instead, a slow, sad, infinitely weary smile touched Mara's lips. It was not a smile of amusement or happiness. It was a smile of profound, heartbreaking resignation. It was the smile of a soldier laying down her arms after a long and painful war. She gave him a small, final nod, a gesture of release, of letting go, and then she turned and walked away. Not with haste or anger, but with the calm, deliberate grace of someone who had made a decision. She moved through the crowd, a river of midnight silk parting before her, heading for the arched doors that led out of the ballroom and away from him. The sight broke something inside him. The validation he had been chasing turned sour, the attention of the court felt suffocating, and Isolene's pretty, vapid face was suddenly repulsive. He had wanted a reaction, and he had gotten one, but it was not the one he had prepared for. This was not a declaration of war. It was a surrender. He had not provoked a fight, he had merely confirmed an ending. "Your Majesty." Isolene's voice was a tinny intrusion. He thrust his glass into her hand without a word and pushed past her, striding back into the ballroom. The whispers followed him, a hiss of speculation and judgment. He ignored them. He had to get to her. He had to understand that smile. He pushed through the throngs of dancers, his heart hammering a frantic, terrified rhythm against his ribs. He burst through the doors into the long, marble corridor, lit by the cool, impartial light of the moon slanting through the high windows. He saw her at the far end, her silhouette framed by the entrance to the Gallery of Kings. "Mara," he roared, his voice echoing off the stone walls. She stopped but didn't turn. Her shoulders slumped, a subtle, devastating admission of defeat. He stalked towards her, his mind a whirlwind of angry, wounded pride. What was that? That look. "You smile and walk away as if I am nothing to you. After all this, after everything, is that all I get? A damned smile?" He was inches from her now, his voice raw, his body thrumming with the need for a confrontation. He reached out, grabbing her shoulder to spin her around. "Answer me." He expected her to pull away, to slap him, to finally unleash the torrent of anger he had been trying to summon for months. But the body he turned was limp, her resistance gone. Her face, when she looked up at him, was shockingly pale in the moonlight, her beautiful grey eyes clouded with a pain that had nothing to do with him and everything to do with some deeper, more terrible exhaustion. Draven, she whispered, her voice a fragile thread of sound. Please. I can't. Not tonight. And then she collapsed. It wasn't a dramatic, theatrical faint. It was a slow, quiet folding, a marionette whose strings had been cut. Her strength simply evaporated, and she crumpled towards the cold marble floor. His anger vanished in a flash of pure, ice-cold terror. He caught her, her body shockingly light in his arms, her head lolling against his chest. Her skin was clammy, her breathing shallow and ragged. Mara, he breathed, his voice tight with panic. He lowered her gently to the floor, cradling her head in his lap. Mara, wake up. Open your eyes. He brushed the hair from her face, his hands shaking violently. The serene, distant queen was gone, replaced by this terrifyingly fragile woman. Guards, he bellowed, his voice cracking. Fetch the royal healer, now. The minutes that followed were a blur of panicked activity that seemed to happen at a great distance from him. Guards came running, their armor clattering on the marble. Servants appeared with pillows and blankets. The distant music of the gala seemed like a grotesque mockery. Draven never moved. He stayed on the floor, holding his wife, murmuring her name over and over again like a prayer, his mind a blank wall of white-hot fear. Healer Elara arrived, a stern, grey-haired woman whose composure was a rock in his churning sea of panic. She knelt beside them, her movements efficient and calm as she checked Mara's pulse, her breathing, the pupils of her eyes. She pressed a vial of pungent salts beneath Mara's nose, but there was no response. Your Majesty, we must move her to her chambers, Elara said, her voice low but firm, cutting through his haze. He carried her himself. He swept her up into his arms and strode through the castle, past the shocked faces of his courtiers who had spilled out of the ballroom to witness the drama. He didn't see them. He saw only the waxy pallor of his wife's skin, the blue tinge of her lips. He laid her on her bed, the midnight silk of her gown pooling around her like a dark omen. Elara and her acolytes descended, lighting lamps, brewing herbs, their soft, urgent whispers filling the room. Draven was pushed aside, forced to stand in the corner, a helpless, useless king in his own home. He watched them work for what felt like an eternity. They drew blood, a dark, sluggish crimson. They bathed her forehead with cool cloths. They forced a few drops of a pungent liquid between her lips. The silence in the room was heavy, broken only by Mara's shallow breaths and the quiet clink of glass vials. Finally, Elara straightened up, her face grim, her expression unreadable. She dismissed her acolytes with a flick of her hand and turned to face him. Your Majesty, she began, her voice devoid of its usual deference. It was the voice of a professional delivering a verdict. What is it? Draven demanded, his voice hoarse. Is it poison? An affliction? Elara looked at him, and for the first time, he saw not a servant of the crown, but a woman filled with a weary, pitying contempt. It is not poison, my king. It is the wasting sickness. The name was an old one, a dreaded whisper from history books. It was a slow decay, an illness that hollowed its victims out from the inside, stealing their strength, their color, their very life force, until nothing was left. It was incurable. It was a death sentence. No, Draven whispered, the word a denial against a tidal wave of truth. No, that's not possible. She was fine. She was. He trailed off, the images of the past months flashing through his mind, the uneaten meals, the shadows under her eyes, the trembling hand. The signs had all been there. He had just been too blind, too absorbed in his own pathetic melodrama, to see them. She has been hiding it for many months, Elara continued, her voice relentless. She swore me to secrecy. She did not want to be a burden. She did not want you to pity her. The healer's words were hammer blows, each one shattering a piece of his reality. Hiding it. She had been carrying this monstrous secret, this slow, creeping death, all while he had been parading his manufactured pain in front of her. The weight of his cruelty, of his monumental selfishness, crashed down on him with physical force, stealing the air from his lungs. Why? He choked out. Why wouldn't she tell me? Elara's gaze was like a shard of ice. She did not want your grief to cloud your judgment. She knew the kingdom would need a queen. She knew you would need a queen. The healer took a deep breath, and her next words were delivered with the cold precision of a scalpel. She wasn't ignoring your dalliances, Your Majesty. She was enduring them. She was watching. She told me she had to be sure. She was vetting your companions. Draven stared at her, uncomprehending. Vetting? Yes, Ilara confirmed, her voice merciless. She was trying to find your replacement. Someone who could love you. Someone who could make you happy when she was gone. The world did not shatter. It simply ceased to exist. The opulent room, the flickering lamplight, the stern face of the healer, it all dissolved into a roaring, colorless void. The sound in his ears was the echo of his own soul breaking apart. Vetting his replacement. The laughter of Lady Seraphina, the witty debates with the Duchess, the blushing adoration of Lady Isoline, none of it had been a torment to Mara. It had been an audition. She had watched him with other women, not with jealousy, but with the desperate, selfless eye of a dying wife trying to secure her husband's future happiness. Her quiet smiles were not indifference, they were assessments. Her weary nods were not boredom, they were approvals or dismissals. Her silence was not the absence of love, it was the most profound, most agonizing act of love he had ever known. He had thought her a placid star, cool and distant. He was wrong. She was a supernova, burning herself out from the inside, and he had been dancing in her light, a stupid, glorious fool, utterly oblivious to the magnitude of her sacrifice. A strangled sound tore from his throat, a noise of such profound agony that the healer took a step back. He stumbled forward and fell to his knees beside the bed. He reached out a trembling hand, his fingers hovering over Mara's still face. She looked so peaceful, as if she had finally been allowed to rest after a long and terrible battle. A battle she had fought alone, while he, her husband, her king, had been her tormentor. The rage came then, but it was not directed at the fates or the sickness. It was a white-hot, self-devouring rage. He was an immortal king. He had commanded armies, bent the will of nature, and communed with ancient powers. He had lived for centuries, hoarding his power, his life, like a dragon hoarding gold. And for what? To stand by helplessly and watch the only thing that gave his endless life meaning flicker out? No. The thought was unacceptable. The universe would not take her from him. He would not allow it. He rose to his feet, a terrifying calm settling over him. He looked at the healer, his eyes burning with a light she had never seen before. "Leave us," he commanded, his voice a low growl of absolute authority. "Your Majesty, there is nothing more to be done. She needs rest." "I said, leave us," he roared, and the very air in the room crackled with power, the flames in the lamps flaring high. Ilara, wise enough to recognize a power that dwarfed her own, bowed her head and backed out of the room, closing the heavy oak doors behind her. He was alone with her. The silence he had so feared was now his sanctuary. He walked to the bed and gently, so gently, brushed a stray lock of hair from her forehead. Her skin was cool to the touch, a terrifying premonition of the cold to come. He could feel her life force, a fragile, fluttering thread, growing thinner with every shallow breath. He would not let it snap. He knelt again, placing one hand on her heart and the other on his own. He closed his eyes, shutting out the world, and turned his focus inward, to the ancient, thrumming core of his own immortality. It was a vast, boundless ocean of energy, a gift or a curse from the old gods, an endless well of life that had sustained him through countless ages. It was his most prized possession, the very definition of his being. And he was about to break it in half. He began the incantation, the words a language older than any spoken by men, a tongue of pure power that vibrated not in the air but in the very fabric of his soul. The ritual was forbidden, a desperate act that defied the natural order of life and death. To bind a mortal life to an immortal one was to create a paradox, an imbalance with a terrible cost. He knew the price. He would forfeit half of his soul, half of his immortality. He would become a creature of twilight, no longer truly immortal but not yet mortal. He would feel the slow creep of age, the sting of wounds, the weariness of time. And one day, far in the future, he would die. But she would live. She would live as long as he did. Her life would be tied to his, her flame fed by the oil of his own existence. The pain was unlike anything he had ever known. It was not a physical agony of flesh and bone, but a spiritual tearing, a ripping of the soul. It felt as if he were being split in two from the inside out. The room grew impossibly cold, frost blooming in intricate patterns on the window panes. The light from the lamps dimmed, guttering as if starved of air. A silent scream echoed in the hollows of his mind, a howl of protest from his own ancient life force as it was sundered. He gritted his teeth, sweat beading on his brow, and pushed harder, pouring his very essence, his memories of sunlight, his long centuries of life, into her. He felt the connection take hold, a thread of golden light spinning out from his chest and weaving itself into the fading silver of hers. He felt her faint pulse begin to steady, to strengthen, drawing life from him. He pushed more, giving her everything he could, a desperate, profligate offering. He gave her the warmth of 1,000 summers, the resilience of ancient mountains, the unwavering strength of the tides. He poured it all into her, holding nothing back, until he felt a great, shuddering finality as the bond sealed. A deep, aching emptiness opened up inside him, a hollow space where half of his soul had been. He was diminished. He was halved. He was, for the first time in centuries, vulnerable. He collapsed forward, his head resting on the edge of the mattress, his body trembling with exhaustion and the shock of the ritual. The room slowly returned to normal. The frost on the windows melted, and the lamps burned brightly once more. He listened, his ear pressed close to her chest. And he heard it. The slow, steady, rhythmic beat of her heart. Strong. Sure. Alive. He had done it. He had chained her to life, and in doing so, had chained himself to a future he had never imagined, a future with an ending. A sob of relief, of grief, of overwhelming love, escaped him. He didn't move. He simply knelt there, in the quiet of the room, listening to the sound of his own sacrifice beating in her chest. The days that followed bled into weeks, the weeks into months. The raucous, glittering life of the court ceased as if a switch had been thrown. The laughter died, the music faded, and a profound, watchful quiet descended upon the castle. The starlight gala became a whispered, scandalous memory. Lady Isoline was sent back to the Summer Isles. The other ladies of the court, once so eager for the king's attention, now scattered like birds before a storm whenever he appeared. But he rarely did. His world had shrunk to the four walls of Mara's chambers. He had a simple wooden chair brought in and placed beside her bed, and there he sat a day. It became his throne, his office, his entire world. He dismissed the servants, the nurses, even healer Elara, attending to Mara's needs himself with a clumsy, desperate tenderness. He bathed her brow with cool water when a fever took her. He learned to brew the strengthening teas the healer prescribed, his large, scarred hands surprisingly gentle as he measured herbs and poured steaming water. He held her hand, his thumb stroking the back of hers, for hours on end, feeling the steady, reassuring pulse that was now a part of his own. When the silence became too heavy, he began to read to her. At first, he read from the royal histories, his voice a low, formal drone filling the space with tales of his ancestors, of battles won and kingdoms built. But the words felt hollow, a recitation of a life that no longer felt like his own. He switched to poetry, the lyrical verses of love and loss feeling closer to the turmoil in his own heart. But it was when he found a worn volume of children's fables in a dusty corner of the royal library that he found his true voice. He read her stories of clever foxes and foolish trolls, of brave princesses and enchanted forests. His voice, once a booming instrument of command and seduction, softened into a quiet, gentle murmur. He gave each character a different tone, his performance not for a crowded court, but for an audience of one. He read of sacrifices made for love, of the quiet magic found in simple kindness, and the words were a balm to his own ravaged soul. In the telling of these simple tales, he was unmaking the arrogant king and finding the man he should have been all along. This was his penance. The long, quiet hours were a crucible, burning away the dross of his ego, his insecurity, his addiction to noise. He had always believed that love had to be loud, a grand, dramatic performance. He had mistaken peace for the absence of passion. Now, sitting in the quiet room, watching the slow rise and fall of Mara's chest, he was discovering the truth. Peace was not the absence of anything. It was the presence of everything that mattered. It was the profound, bone-deep intimacy of shared space, of silent companionship. It was the trust that someone would simply be there. It was a privilege, a fragile, precious gift that he had almost shattered in his foolishness. He watched her, truly saw her, for the first time in a long time. He memorized the sweep of her dark lashes against her pale cheek, the gentle curve of her lips in sleep, the way a stray strand of hair would catch the morning light. He saw the faint lines of worry around her eyes, etched there by the burdens of queenship and her own secret suffering, and he felt a protective tenderness so fierce it was a physical ache in his chest. He had wanted her to fight for him, but she had been fighting a far greater battle, and she had been fighting it for both of them. One afternoon, 3 months after the gala, he was reading a story about a star who fell in love with a mortal man and chose to fall to earth to be with him, knowing her light would one day fade. The sunlight was streaming through the window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. He felt a faint pressure on his hand. He stopped reading, his heart ceasing to beat for a moment. He looked down. Her fingers, so long limp in his, had curled weakly around his own. He held his breath. Her eyelashes fluttered. Then, slowly, her eyes opened. They were no longer clouded with pain, but clear, the color of a soft gray dawn. They focused on his face, taking him into the dark circles under his own eyes, the new lines of strain around his mouth, the quiet desperation in his gaze. Draven. Her voice was a dry, raspy whisper, the first word she had spoken in months. The sound of his name on her lips broke him. Tears he hadn't known he was holding back welled in his eyes and streamed down his face. "I'm here," he choked out, his voice thick. "Mara. I'm here." She blinked slowly, her mind working to piece together the lost time. She looked around the room, at the chair, at the book lying open in his lap. Her gaze returned to him, filled with a dawning confusion. What happened? He took a breath, knowing this was the moment of truth. He would not lie to her. He would not hide the cost. He owed her the honesty he had denied her for so long. "You were sick," he said, his voice low and steady. "The wasting sickness. You were." Dying. He saw the flicker of acknowledgement, of sorrow, in her eyes. She remembered. "But I feel," she trailed off, shifting slightly in the bed, a flicker of surprise on her face as she felt an unfamiliar strength in her limbs. "I feel well. I healed you," he said simply. He raised their joined hands. "I bound your life to mine. You will live as long as I do." He didn't say the rest. He didn't speak of the price, of the halved soul, of the immortality he had sacrificed. It was not a debt for her to repay, it was a gift, an apology, the only one he knew how to give. But she was brilliant. She was his clever, perceptive Mara. She looked at him, truly looked, and saw the change in him. It was more than just fatigue. There was a new fragility in his eyes, a subtle dimming of the powerful, immortal aura that had always surrounded him. She understood. Her own eyes filled with tears, but they were not tears of gratitude. They were tears of profound, aching sorrow. "Oh, you foolish, foolish man," she whispered, her voice cracking with emotion. "All that work, all that pain, wasted." He shook his head, bringing her hand to his lips and kissing her knuckles. "Nothing about you is a waste," he said, the words coming from the deepest part of his remade soul. "The only thing wasted was the time I spent not seeing you. Not truly seeing you. Can you ever forgive me?" Mara didn't answer with words. She used what little strength she had to pull her hand free and lift it to his face, her fingers cool against his tear-stained cheek. Her thumb brushed away a tear. It was a gesture of such profound and unconditional forgiveness that it felt like grace. In that single, quiet touch, she told him everything he needed to know. That they were not broken. That this was not an ending, but a new and fragile beginning. Her recovery was a slow, quiet miracle. Each day, she grew a little stronger. The first time she sat up on her own, leaning against a mountain of pillows, they shared a simple meal of broth and bread, the silence between them comfortable, companionable. The first time she stood, leaning heavily on him, her legs trembling, he felt a surge of triumphant joy that eclipsed any victory he had ever known on the battlefield. He helped her walk. At first, it was just a few steps around the room, then a slow shuffle down the corridor. He was her crutch, her anchor, his arm wrapped securely around her waist, his body shielding hers. He learned the geography of her weakness and the map of her returning strength. He learned to move at her pace, a lesson in patience his immortal life had never taught him. The day she was strong enough to walk in the gardens was a revelation. The sun was warm, the air filled with the scent of late-blooming roses. She was still pale, still slender, but there was a new light in her eyes, a quiet resilience that had been forged in pain and sacrifice. She leaned on his arm, her steps slow but steady. "You're quiet," she observed, her voice still soft but gaining its familiar musicality. He looked down at her, at the way the sunlight caught in her dark hair. "I'm learning to listen," he said. "I spent so long making noise, I forgot what a gift silence can be. Especially with you." She stopped by a stone bench overlooking the city, the kingdom she had so diligently cared for while he had played his games. She looked out at the view, then up at him. "You know," she said, a faint, teasing smile playing on her lips, "it was Lady Isoline. I had almost decided on her for you." His heart clenched. "Mara, don't." "No, listen," she insisted, her expression turning serious. "She was kind. She was cheerful. I thought she would make you laugh. I thought she would be good for you. I was wrong, of course. She would have bored you within a year. You were wrong about what I needed," he corrected her gently. "I didn't need to be entertained. I didn't need chaos or laughter or passion. I just needed you. I thought that was what you wanted," she confessed, her gaze dropping. "The fire. The fight. I thought my stillness was a disappointment to you." It was the heart of their misunderstanding, a chasm of insecurity they had both been too afraid to cross. He had feared her stillness was a lack of love, and she had feared her stillness was a source of his disappointment. He reached out, tilting her chin up so she had to meet his eyes. "Your stillness," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "is my home. It's the harbor I didn't know I was searching for. The fire is lovely, Mara, but it's the quiet warmth of the hearth that gets you through the winter. I was just too much of a fool to know the difference." She leaned her head against his shoulder, her hand coming up to rest on his chest, right over his heart. They stood there for a long time, watching the sun begin its slow descent, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. The silence between them was not empty. It was full. It was full of unspoken apologies, of hard-won forgiveness, of a love that had been tested and torn apart and had somehow, miraculously, been pieced back together, stronger and more precious than before. That evening, he didn't read to her from the Book of Fables. They simply sat by the fire in her chambers, a blanket shared over their laps. He told her about his day, the tedious but necessary meetings with the council, the dispute he'd settled between two border lords. She, in turn, told him of her small victories, walking the length of the gallery unaided, finishing a whole bowl of soup. They were small, mundane things, the simple currency of a shared life. And it was glorious. He found he had no desire for the noise and chaos of the court. His addiction had been broken. The validation he had craved from others was a pale imitation of the quiet approval he saw in his wife's eyes. He had spent months trying to provoke a reaction from her, and in the end, her quiet endurance had provoked a total transformation in him. He had sacrificed half of his soul to save her life, but the truth was, she had saved all of his. She had saved him from the endless, lonely void of his own immortality, from the hollow man he was becoming. Later, as he helped her to bed, she paused, her hand on his arm. "Draven," she said, her voice serious. "You gave up everything for me." "No," he corrected her, his hands framing her face, his gaze intense and unwavering. "I gave up nothing. An eternity without you would have been an empty one. I would rather have a single lifetime, a single day, with you than all the ages of this world alone. You are my life, Mara. It's as simple as that." He kissed her then, a kiss that held no desperate passion or performative flair. It was a kiss of quiet reverence, of profound gratitude. It was the kiss of a man who had stared into the abyss of losing everything and had been given a second chance.